The photographer moved the camera 6 inches to the left, framed the long banquet table, and waited for the woman in the wheelchair to roll out of the shot. He didn't ask her to move. He just lifted his palm, the way you'd shoo a cat off a counter, and angled the lens past her shoulder toward the empty chairs behind. Vivian Hale watched her own reflection slide off the glass. "That's perfect," he said to nobody. "Hold that." She sat at the head of the table in the Ashford Hotel's Magnolia Ballroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, on the night of her 38th birthday, and for 19 seconds she did not exist in a single frame the man would later hand to the people who'd planned this party. $312 million in company valuation. A name newspapers had once printed in bold, and a chair that ruined the composition. Nobody in that room knew who she really was, not the version on the website. To understand how a woman could be erased from her own birthday, you have to go back 2 hours, to the moment Garrett Cole made a phone call he thought no one would ever trace. The invitations had gone out 40 days earlier, 200 of them cream cardstock, embossed, the kind of paper that costs more than a tank of gas per sheet. They went to board members, to investors who'd ridden Meridian Pay from a garage startup to a payments platform that moved $9 billion a year. They went to the mayor's office, to 2 state senators, to the founders of 3 rival firms who'd publicly called Vivian the sharpest operator in the Southeast. Every single one confirmed. Her assistant, a careful young man named Theo, printed the final head count and taped it to the kitchen door so the catering team could plate exactly right. 194 guests. He even ordered extra chairs. What Theo didn't know was that at 4:51 that afternoon, Garrett Cole had started dialing. Garrett was the chief financial officer. He'd been with the company 11 years, longer than almost anyone, and for 11 years he'd watched Vivian get the magazine covers while he got the spreadsheets. He told himself it didn't bother him. He told himself a lot of things. The truth was that Garrett Cole had been the one who kept the lights on during the lean years, who'd restructured the debt in 2019 when the company nearly folded, who'd worked Christmas Eve 3 years running while Vivian was on a magazine's 40 Under 40 cover, holding a coffee mug she didn't even drink from. He believed, with the particular conviction of a man who is half right, that he had built this place too, and that the world had simply never noticed because he wasn't photogenic and he wasn't a story. There is a version of Garrett's grievance that is true. That's what made him dangerous. But the truth lived in his chest like a stone, and the truth was this. The accident 2 years ago had cracked something open in him, and what crawled out wasn't grief, and it wasn't justice either. It was opportunity, and he dressed it up as both. He'd seen the medical reports. He'd seen the days she came in late, the meetings she joined remotely because the pain in her lower spine made the drive unbearable. He'd done the math the way he did all math, cold and clean, and the math said the board was nervous, and a nervous board could be turned. He just needed them to see her the way he'd taught himself to see her, diminished. A risk. A liability with a beautiful smile. So he called them one at a time. He didn't lie, not exactly. He was too smart for lies that could be quoted back. He used the soft words, the ones that slide in sideways. "I just want to give you a heads up," he'd say, lowering his voice like he was doing them a favor. "Vivian's health hasn't been stable. Tonight could get uncomfortable. I'd hate for you to be put in an awkward position. You understand what I mean. And here is the part that should make your skin crawl." Every one of them understood. Not one of them asked a follow-up question. Not one said, "She's the woman who built the thing that pays your bonus. You should go." They thanked Garrett for the warning, and they each found a reason, and the reasons piled up in Theo's voicemail like snow on a windshield. A delayed flight, a sick child, a board obligation, traffic on I-77. Some of them didn't even bother to call. They just didn't come. By 6:40, Theo had stopped answering his phone. He stood in the hallway outside the ballroom with his back against the wallpaper, and he didn't go in because he didn't know how to walk into a room and tell a woman he admired that the world had quietly decided she wasn't worth the drive. Inside, Vivian already knew. She'd known since the 3rd cancellation, the way you know a storm before the first drop hits the glass. She sat at the head of the table, and she did the thing she'd learned to do in 2 years of physical therapy, the thing they don't teach you in business school. She kept her face still. She placed both hands flat on the white tablecloth, and she breathed, slow, counting the way the therapist had taught her. And she did not let the room see the thing happening behind her eyes. That's when Garrett walked in. He arrived at 6:47, 13 minutes before a party that was already over, and he came in fast and bright in a charcoal suit that cost more than Theo made in a month, smelling of cedar and confidence. He scanned the room. He saw the empty chairs, and something flickered across his face. Just for a half second, that wasn't surprise at all. It was satisfaction, dressed up as concern. "Vivian," he said warmly, "my God, where is everyone?" She looked at him. She knew, he knew, she knew, and both of them kept smiling, because that's how it works at the top, where the knives are quiet and the wounds are always called something else. Garrett's eyes traveled to her wheelchair, parked at the head of the table where a host belongs. He turned to a hovering hotel staffer, a young woman with a clipboard, and he said it just loud enough. "Let's adjust the seating diagram. That spot doesn't photograph well." Then he walked away. He didn't look at Vivian again. He crossed to the bar, poured himself 2 fingers of something amber, checked his watch, and made a second call, his back to the room. His voice too low to carry. He was telling someone the plan had worked. He was telling someone the board would see, by Monday, exactly what he wanted them to see. What Garrett Cole did not know, the thing that would make him the most reckless man in Charlotte that night, was that the legal documents that controlled the entire future of Meridian Pay were already in a black leather folder, already signed, already sitting in the passenger seat of a car headed downtown. And the woman driving that car had loved Vivian Hale for 19 years. But we'll get to her. For now, Garrett finished his drink, and at 7:02 he leaned down by Vivian's chair, close, the way you'd speak to someone in a hospital bed, and he said the thing that he'd been saving, the thing he believed was kindness. "Vivian, you should think about resting. The board worries about you. Not everything has to be carried by someone in your situation. There's no shame in stepping back." He squeezed her shoulder once. Then he left, through the big double doors, out into a night where his partners were waiting at a steakhouse to celebrate a victory they were sure was already won. The doors swung shut behind him. Vivian sat alone in a room built for 200. The chandelier threw gold across 40 empty place settings. The 3-tier cake, vanilla with raspberry between the layers, the only cake she'd ever actually wanted, sat untouched in the center of it all. 38 candles unlit. A pianist in the corner had stopped playing somewhere around 6:55 and was now quietly fitting his sheet music back into a case, glancing at her, unsure whether leaving would be cruel or merciful. She looked down at her hands. And here is something she had never told anyone. The thing that lived in her the way the stone lived in Garrett, except hers, was made of guilt instead of envy. 3 years before the accident, when she was running hard and fast and untouchable, a junior analyst named Aaron Whitfield had come into her office and asked for an accommodation, a flexible schedule. He had multiple sclerosis, early stage, and he was managing it, and he needed 2 mornings a week, and Vivian, who was 33 and brilliant and in a hurry, had looked at him the way Garrett looked at her now. Not cruel, worse than cruel. Efficient. She'd said the company couldn't set that precedent. She'd said it kindly. Aaron had left within the month, and she hadn't thought about him again until the day she woke up in a hospital, and a nurse asked her to rate her pain from 1 to 10, and she'd held up her own hand and couldn't feel it. She put her hand on the wheel of her chair now. Then she took it off. She did not cry. She just sat in the quiet, which was louder than any boardroom she'd ever ruled. And she thought, for the first time in her life, that maybe everyone had only ever admired the running. And nobody had loved the woman who could no longer run. Across the city, in a different kind of quiet, a man named Raymond Pierce was clocking in for the night shift. Raymond was 41. He'd spent 12 years in the Army, 2 deployments, and he'd come home with a piece of metal still lodged near his left femur, close enough to the bone that the surgeons had decided it was safer to leave it than to dig. So he walked with a limp on cold nights, and Charlotte in late autumn was cold enough. But he didn't use a cane, and he didn't tell people, and most folks who passed him at the security desk of the Ashford Hotel saw nothing but a big, tired man in a gray uniform watching a wall of monitors. His wife, Delia, had died 3 years ago, pancreatic, 11 weeks from the diagnosis to the morning he woke up and the other side of the bed was cold. They'd never had kids. The apartment was very quiet now, and Raymond had taken the night shift on purpose, because the hours when other people slept were the hardest, and at least here, the monitors kept him company. He was eating a gas station sandwich at the desk when he noticed her. Monitor 7. The Magnolia Ballroom. A woman alone at a long table, in a wheelchair, in a room dressed for a celebration that hadn't happened. He watched a staffer carry out a tray of untouched food. He watched the pianist pack up and leave. He watched the woman sit perfectly still, hands flat on the table, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that Raymond recognized instantly, because he had sat exactly like that in a recovery ward at Fort Bragg 8 years ago, on his own 33rd birthday, when the phone by his bed didn't ring once. He knew that stillness. It wasn't calm. It was the thing you do with your body when crying isn't an option and screaming isn't allowed. Raymond looked at the sandwich in his hand. He set it down. He didn't move right away. He wasn't a man who barged into things. He told himself it wasn't his business, that a security guard had no place walking into a private event, that he'd probably get a complaint, maybe a write-up, and he needed this job. He told himself all the reasonable things. And then he thought about the night nobody called. He'd made a promise to himself in that recovery ward, the kind of promise you make in the dark that you usually forget by morning. He'd promised that if he ever saw someone sitting alone like he was sitting, he wouldn't let them. He'd kept exactly 0 opportunities to test it, until Monitor 7. So this is the truth about why Raymond Pierce stood up. It wasn't sweetness. It wasn't a children's story kind of kindness. It was a debt. He owed it to a younger man in a hospital bed, and you don't get to choose when the bill comes due. He walked the long way through the service corridor, his left leg complaining the whole way, and he stopped at the vending machine outside the kitchen because some animal instinct told him you don't show up to a birthday with nothing. He had $4 in quarters. The machine took 3 of them and dropped a single cold can of Coca-Cola into the tray with a clunk that echoed down the empty hall. He picked it up. He stood outside the ballroom doors, and for the first time in 3 years, Raymond Pierce's heart was beating like it had something to lose. He pushed the door open. Vivian's head came up. A man in a security uniform was standing in the doorway holding a soda can, and the first thing she felt, God help her, was the old reflex, the executive armor snapping into place. Who let him in? What does he want? Is this a problem? Raymond crossed the room slowly. He stopped a respectful distance from her chair. He set the can of Coca-Cola down on the white tablecloth beside a plate that had been waiting 4 hours for a guest who wasn't coming. I don't have a gift, he said. His voice was rougher than he expected, but nobody should drink alone on their birthday. Vivian looked at the can. Condensation was already beating on the aluminum, a small wet ring spreading on the linen that cost $40 a yard. She looked at the man. He wasn't dressed for this. He didn't belong here. He had the wrong shoes and the wrong job and a name she didn't know, and he had brought her the only thing he could afford from a machine in a hallway. And for the first time that night, Vivian Hale smiled. It started small, just a tremor at the corner of her mouth, and then it broke fully across her face, and her eyes were wet now, but she didn't fight it anymore, because something about the absurd, perfect dignity of a cold soda can on a $50,000 table had undone every careful thing she'd been holding together since 6:40. Sit, she said, please. Raymond pulled out the chair to her right, the one Garrett had wanted moved, and he sat. His knee popped. He winced. She noticed, and she didn't say anything, and he noticed her not saying anything. And that was somehow the beginning of a conversation neither of them knew how to start. They started anyway. He told her about Delia, in pieces, the way men like Raymond tell things, sideways and slow. 11 weeks, the way she'd organized her own medications by color so he wouldn't have to learn. The way she'd made him promise to keep the night shift because she knew the daytime apartment would swallow him. He told her about the metal in his leg, and the recovery ward, and the birthday phone that didn't ring. Vivian listened. She, who interrupted board members mid-sentence, who'd built a career on getting to the point, sat and listened to a man she'd met 4 minutes ago, and somewhere in the listening she stopped performing. She told him about the highway, the rain, the semi that crossed 3 lanes at 6:14 on a Tuesday evening because the driver had been awake for 19 hours, a fact she'd learned later and had decided, eventually, not to hate him for, because hating him changed nothing about her spine and cost her something she couldn't spare. She told him about the 18 months of learning to do everything again from a seated position, the way the world rearranged itself into things she could reach and things she couldn't. The top shelf of her own kitchen, the brake pedal of a car she'd loved, the way people now crouched down to talk to her like she was a child, or worse, talk to whoever was standing next to her instead. That one, Raymond said, the talking to the other person thing. They do that to me at the VA when I bring my paperwork in, like the limp ate my ears. Vivian laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. Garrett did it tonight, to my own assistant, about my own seating chart. Garrett the suit who left. Garrett the suit who left. Raymond turned the soda can a quarter turn on the tablecloth, thinking. My drill sergeant used to say a man shows you who he is the first time he thinks nobody important is watching. Problem is, half the time the person watching is the one he wrote off. He shrugged. Sounds like your Garrett wrote you off. She didn't answer that right away. She did not tell him she was the CEO. He did not ask what she did. For one strange hour, neither of those things mattered, and that, she would think later, was the most honest hour she'd had in years, an hour where her title couldn't enter the room, and so the actual person had to. And then the staff started coming back. It began with a chef named Marcus, who'd been in the kitchen breaking down stations, and who'd watched the whole thing unfold on a monitor of his own. He came out wiping his hands on his apron, and he stopped at the table, and he said, Ma'am, that cake is too good to waste. You want me to cut it? A line cook came next. Then a bartender, a housekeeper who'd been turning down rooms on the 4th floor, heard from someone and came down still holding a stack of folded towels. The pianist, who'd made it as far as the parking garage, came back in, took off his coat, sat down at the bench, and let his fingers find the opening notes of Happy Birthday, soft, almost a whisper, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. Within 15 minutes, the Magnolia Ballroom was not empty. It was full of the wrong people, which is to say, exactly the right ones. 11 hotel employees who'd spent all day building a celebration for guests who never came and who'd decided, one by one, that they were not going to let the day end the way Garrett Cole had designed it to end. Marcus cut the cake. The bartender poured sparkling cider into champagne flutes because most of them were technically still on the clock. The housekeeper, whose name was Rosa, lit all 38 candles with a long match she'd found in a supply closet, and the room filled with that small, warm light, and they sang. They sang badly, off-key, mismatched, a security guard and a chef and a pianist and a woman with a stack of towels, and it was the most beautiful sound Vivian had heard in 2 years. She blew out the candles. Raymond watched her do it and thought about Delia. Everyone clapped, and nobody, not one person in that room, took a photograph because the photographer was long gone, and these were not people who experienced their own lives through a lens. They just lived it. What none of them knew, what was still unfolding in the dark city outside, was that a car had just pulled into the hotel's circular drive, and a woman named Eleanor Voss was stepping out of it with a black leather folder pressed against her chest. Eleanor was 61. She'd been Meridian's general counsel since before it had a name, since it was Vivian and 3 engineers and a whiteboard in a rented room above a barbecue joint. She'd written the company's first contract on a legal pad. She'd held Vivian's hand in the hospital, and that afternoon, while Garrett Cole was making his phone calls, Eleanor had been doing something else entirely. Because Garrett had made one mistake. The thing about quiet knives is that they leave fingerprints. His secret afternoon board meeting, the one where he'd laid out his case for transitioning leadership during a period of medical instability, The one he thought was off the record had been recorded, not by him, by a board member named Patricia Lowe, 73 years old, who had backed Vivian's first round of funding when no bank in Charlotte would, and who did not like the smell of what Garrett was cooking. Patricia had hit record on her phone the moment she felt her stomach turn, and at 8:40 she had called Eleanor Voss, and she had played her every word. Eleanor had listened to 41 minutes of Garrett Cole explaining, in his soft sideways voice, exactly how he intended to remove the woman who'd built the company because she now sat in a chair he found inconvenient. She had listened to 2 board members agree. She had listened to the plan to use tonight, the empty birthday, as evidence in a Monday filing that Vivian was isolated and no longer commanding confidence. And then Eleanor had gotten in her car. She came through the ballroom doors at 9:23, and she stopped, and the singing had ended, but the room was still warm and full and bright, and she saw Vivian at the head of the table with a soda can in front of her, and 11 hotel employees gathered around, and she had to set the folder down on a side table and put her hand over her mouth for a moment before she could speak. "Vivian," she said. The room went quiet. Raymond stood, the old instinct, putting himself half a step in front of the woman beside him without quite knowing why. Eleanor walked to the head of the table. She opened her laptop. She set it down where Vivian could see, and she said, in a voice that did not shake because Eleanor Voss had not let her voice shake in, 40 years of doing this work, Patricia sent me something this evening. I think you need to hear it, all of it, and then you need to decide what we do." She pressed play. Garrett's voice filled the Magnolia ballroom, soft, reasonable, damning. 41 minutes compressed into the worst 3, the part where he said the word liability, the part where he said the optics of her condition, the part where he laughed, a small dry laugh, and said that an empty birthday party would make the case for us better than any memo could. The chef stopped wiping the counter. Rosa set down her towels. The bartender's hand froze on a bottle. 11 strangers stood in a borrowed room and listened to a powerful man explain why a woman they'd just spent an hour singing to didn't deserve the company she'd built. Raymond's jaw was a hard line. He looked at Vivian, and Vivian Hale did not move. Her hands were flat on the table again. Her breathing was slow and counted, but this time, the stillness was not the stillness of a woman holding herself together so she wouldn't break. It was the stillness of a woman deciding what kind of person she was going to be. Because here is the thing Eleanor's recording did. It didn't just expose Garrett. It held up a mirror, and in that mirror, for one terrible second, Vivian saw Aaron Whitfield walking out of her office 8 years ago after she'd looked at his condition and decided it was inconvenient. She heard her own kind, efficient voice telling him the company couldn't set that precedent. Garrett's words were her words, wearing a different suit. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked at the can of Coca-Cola, still sweating on the linen, and then at Raymond, and then at the 11 people who had stayed when 200 had not. Across town, Garrett Cole's phone rang at 9:31. He was at a steakhouse called Prime on Tryon, sitting with the 2 board members who'd agreed to the plan, a bottle of wine open on the table, and he was mid-toast when he saw the name on the screen, Patricia Lowe. He silenced it. It rang again. He silenced it again. The 3rd time, one of the board members he was with, a nervous man named David, got a text and read it and went very pale and slid his phone across the white tablecloth so Garrett could see. It was from Patricia. It was 4 words. She has the recording. The wine sat untouched. The steakhouse hummed around them, full of people celebrating things that were actually happening, and at one small table, 3 men sat in absolute silence while a victory they'd been dissolved into something cold and sharp in their stomachs. David stood up first. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. The way you leave a building you suddenly understand is on fire. Garrett sat alone. He poured himself a glass he didn't drink. He thought about every soft, sideways word, every careful sentence designed to be deniable, and he understood, the way you understand a step you've already missed, that none of them had been deniable at all. Patricia Lowe had been recording the entire time. The math he'd done so coldly had been wrong in one variable he'd never accounted for. He'd assumed that everyone at the top played by his rules. He'd never imagined a 73-year-old woman would simply refuse to. Back in the ballroom, the room was waiting. Eleanor had the documents ready, with the recording, with Patricia's vote, with the bylaws Eleanor herself had written. Removing Garrett Cole was no longer a fight. It was a formality, one phone call, one signature. By Monday morning, he would be gone, his options forfeit, his name a cautionary tale whispered in every fintech office on the East Coast. Eleanor laid a single page on the table in front of Vivian and held out a pen. "Say the word," Eleanor said quietly, "and he's finished tonight." Raymond watched her, the hotel staff watched her, the pen hung in the air. And Vivian Hale looked at it for a long moment. Then she took the pen and she set it down, uncapped on the table. "Not the page," Eleanor offered. She turned to a blank one. "Not that," she said, "not yet." The room was quiet enough to hear the chandelier. What Vivian wrote, in the careful hand she'd had to relearn after the accident because the nerve damage went up the right side, was not a termination. It was a proposal. A single paragraph founding a program inside Meridian Pay, a fund and a hiring initiative for employees with disabilities and the people who care for them, structured so that no manager could ever again decide that an accommodation was a precedent the company couldn't afford. At the top of the page, she wrote a name. The Aaron Whitfield Initiative. Eleanor read it upside down. She didn't know the name. Nobody in the room did. But she saw Vivian's hand pause over it, saw something move across her face that wasn't triumph and wasn't anger. And Eleanor, who had known this woman for 19 years, did not ask. Raymond did. "Who's Aaron Whitfield?" he said. Vivian set the pen down. She looked at the can of Coca-Cola, and she said, in a voice so low the chef had to lean in to hear it, "Someone I treated the way Garrett treated me. A long time ago, when I could still walk, and I thought that made me right." The room absorbed that. Nobody filled the silence. Raymond, who had spent 12 years in a place where the truth was usually the only thing worth saying, understood exactly what it cost her to say it, and he did the only respectful thing, which was nothing. He let it stand. "You can still finish Cole tonight," Eleanor said gently. "This doesn't change that." "I know," Vivian said. "I will. He doesn't get to stay." She turned the wheel of her chair slightly so she was facing the room, all 11 of them, the chef and the housekeeper and the bartender and the pianist, and a security guard with a piece of metal in his leg. "But I'm not going to pretend I built this place better than him because my heart was cleaner. It wasn't. I just got knocked down hard enough to remember I had one." Raymond Pierce asked her one more thing then. The question would stay with both of them. "Why not deal with him first?" he said. "Why this?" He gestured at the page, the name, the program. "Man tried to take everything you've got." Vivian looked at the soda can again, the small wet ring it had left on the linen. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Because I used to be Garrett," she said, "and nobody knew." She didn't explain it. She didn't soften it or wrap it up. She let those 5 words sit in the warm, bright room, and she picked the pen back up, and she signed the page that started something before she ever touched the page that ended someone. That's where the night turned, though no one in the room said so. The story doesn't get a neat bow. Garrett Cole was removed from Meridian Pay the following Monday at 9 a.m., escorted out by building security with a cardboard box, and the 2 board members who'd backed him resigned within the week to avoid the same fate. The recording never leaked because Vivian decided that destroying him publicly would make her feel exactly the way he'd wanted to make her feel, and she didn't want to know that feeling. He was finished quietly. The quiet was the point. The Aaron Whitfield Initiative launched 8 weeks later. The real Aaron Whitfield, it turned out, was living in Greensboro, working remotely for a smaller firm that had given him the 2 mornings a week Vivian once wouldn't. She didn't offer him his old job back because she was self-aware enough to know that would be about her conscience and not his life. She just sent him a letter. A real one, handwritten, the slow, careful script, and an apology with no excuse attached to it, and an open invitation that asked for nothing. He wrote back 3 weeks later. They had coffee in March. It is not a tidy reconciliation, and it is not a friendship yet. It is 2 people being honest, which is harder and worth more. Raymond Pierce still works the night shift at the Ashford Hotel. Vivian offered him a position, head of facility security, for Meridian's new downtown campus, a corner office and triple the pay, and he turned it down. He said the night shift suited him. He said he liked the quiet and the monitors, and he had a promise to keep, and a man can only keep that kind of promise from a desk where he's watching for the next person sitting too still. They have dinner once a month. She brings the wine. He brings a six-pack of Coca-Cola in glass bottles, the good kind, and they don't always talk much, and that's fine. Vivian kept the can, the original one, the cold aluminum can from the vending machine. She had it cleaned, and she keeps it on the corner of her desk on the 41st floor, where it makes no sense to any visitor, and she does not explain it to anyone. Sometimes, before a hard decision, she looks at it. Most of those decisions these days she gets right. Some she still doesn't. She's stopped pretending the chair made her wise. It just made her slower, and slow turned out to be where she'd been needing to go. On her 39th birthday, the Magnolia Ballroom was full. Not with senators, not with investors or rivals or names you'd recognize from a magazine. It was full of the people from the Aaron Whitfield Initiative, employees who'd been hired or kept or accommodated, caregivers who'd been given the flexibility Aaron once asked for and didn't get, and 11 hotel staff who got the night off and came anyway. Raymond was there, off duty in an actual shirt instead of the gray uniform, complaining quietly about his leg. Eleanor came. Patricia Lowe, 80 now, fun sharp as a blade, came and made a toast that was mostly an insult and entirely a love letter. There were no professional photographs. A few people took some on their phones, badly, half of them blurry, and in every single one of them, Vivian Hale is at the head of the table, in her chair, exactly where a host belongs, with the frame built round her instead of past her. She blew out the candles. They sang, still off-key, and somewhere in the singing she thought about a different night, a year before, when the same room had been empty, and a man she didn't know had walked in with $3 in quarters and refused to let her disappear. She never found out whether anyone had ever loved the woman who could run. She'd stopped asking. It had turned out to be the wrong question. The right one had walked through the door on a cold night, holding a soda can, and it had a simple answer, and the answer was that you find out who you are not by who shows up when the room is full. You find out by who walks in when it's empty. If you've ever been the person sitting too still in a room full of empty chairs, or the person who almost didn't walk in, I'd really like to know which one you were. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.